Hi everyone, welcome back to Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Today we're going to be wrapping up all of the books that I read in the month of April. Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you are new. My name's Alice and I have way too many books, and this is a video all about the many books that I got through in the end in the month of April. So I actually read 21 books in the month of April for a total of 5,338 pages. So quite a few more books than I normally read, but a similar sort of page count to what I normally read, which is because 67% of my books this month had less than 300 pages. So it was definitely a short book month, and that definitely tied in with the fact that I was ill this month. I would say that at least probably a week of reading was not how I would normally read. Had a couple of days of not reading at all, not really feeling like reading. I had a couple of days where I mainly read picture books for Picture This 2023, and I'm going to be reviewing the picture books in a separate wrap-up of Picture This, which was a lovely readathon hosted by Jack from Spread Book Joy and Shelley from Shelley Swearingen. So I'll talk about those books at a later time. I also read more graphic novels than I normally would, and probably more short books than I usually would, because I was a bit more mood reading. I didn't have the brain space to read the big classic that I had planned to read, but we'll get onto that in a moment. Of the 21 books that I read, one of them was a digital book this month, and that was a graphic novel. I'm finding that I really can't read a proper full-on book on my phone. It just doesn't suit my reading at all, but I'm fine with reading a graphic novel on my phone, no problem. I read 3 audiobooks. 7 of my physical books were library books. 2 of my physical books were rereads. 1 of my physical books was actually a short story within a collection. 7 books came from my Giant TBR. So more on the Giant TBR at the end. 2 of the books that I read this month were non-fiction, which was brilliant for my goal of reading 1 non-fiction book a month, because I didn't read one in the month of March. So there were 3 things I carried over into the month of May. One was the audiobook I was listening to, which was Varjak Paw by SF Said, and I have already now finished that. I also carried on with, and this has been carrying on for a couple of months now, Killer Come Back to Me by Ray Bradbury, and this is a collection of short stories. I actually don't think I read any of these short stories in April. I just didn't feel in the mood for them, so I've left it. I'll go back to it because there's lots of short stories to dip into. And of course I was going to read Crime and Punishment with Sandy from Ms Reads a Lot and Gemma from Gemma Books, and mainly because I was unwell, I just didn't have the brain power to deal with this Russian classic. So I have resumed reading it towards the end of the month and the start of this month. I'm now, I think, over halfway through. Getting on alright with this, but I will talk about it at a later time. So that didn't go so well, but I am confident that I will finish the buddy read eventually. Some of these books that I'm going to mention, some of these 21, I've already reviewed, mainly books that I read for the Women's Prize for Fiction. Talked about them in other videos, and I'll link those videos in the description down below so that you can check those out. I'm going to go roughly in order from my least favourite book of the month to my most favourite. That doesn't mean any of the books were bad books. I just liked some more than others, and yeah, these are just my own opinions as always. Let's dive in with books that I thought were okay to good. So I had a few of these this month, and I'm going to start with Pod by Laline Paul. This is one that I have a longer review of, and I'm not going to go into a huge amount. Things I liked about Pod: it had one character who I really enjoyed following, whose name was Google. He was a dolphin who was trained by the military, and I thought his storyline was particularly poignant and interesting, and I would have liked more from him and probably less from some of the fish characters, who I didn't really think added that much for me. There was a bit too much in this book of the message for my liking. Like, the environmental message was really pushed, and there was also too much trauma rape and sex in this for me, particularly for a book about sea creatures under the ocean. That was really my thoughts on Pod. It was fine. Other than that, it's not really a book for me, I don't think. Next up, we have my last reread of the Into the Library read-along, which I am following along, which is hosted by Ange from Ange's Book Chatter and Amy from BookTube with Amy, and they are reading one of the Aurora Teagarden mysteries every month. April's book was the last book in Omnibus 1, which was called The Julius House. A big amount of this quite short novel is taken over by Aurora's impending marriage, and as part of that marriage she has bought a new house, and the house is quite central to the book, as you can tell from the title, because in this house a family went missing years previously. So in the latter half of the book, Aurora becomes a bit obsessed with finding out what happened to them. And that is the central mystery of this book. I mainly didn't love this because I don't like the love interest character. Yeah, what will happen there, I don't know. I did like a new character who came into this called Angel. She was very interesting, and the second half of the book was a lot more fun than the first. Right, next up I'm going to talk about 3 books, but I wouldn't say all 3 of these deserve to be in this position. So I'll talk about all 3 at the place where I've put the first book in terms of my ranking for the month. So in my okay to good category would be the Baker Street 4 Volume 1. You would have seen these in my haul video from when I went on holiday to Bath in March, and I bought 3 volumes of this, which happened to be Volume 1 and Volume 3 and Volume 4, which was a bit annoying, no Volume 2. I think I sort of read this while I was recovering from being ill, and I didn't particularly enjoy this, so I don't know if that's linked to the fact that I wasn't as much in a reading mood as normal. Each of these books has like 2 comic strips collected in them, and I think it was originally in smaller volumes, so I think this one collects Volume 1 and 2. And the thing that I found really interesting about these books that made me buy them is that these Baker Street 4 are the Baker Street irregulars who are mentioned frequently in Sherlock Holmes, and I did think that this was an interesting take on that. We follow 3 children who are on the streets of London, Victorian London, and a cat, and they make up the Baker Street 4. I didn't particularly think that the adventures in this one were particularly strong on plot, which was my main reason for this ranking so low. I found it disappointing, but I did like the characters quite a lot, so that at least boded well for the other 2. So although I do really like to read things in order, I decided that in the interest of reducing my TBR a bit, and because I was in the mood for more graphic novels, I decided to read the other 2 that I'd bought. If I found them as disappointing as book 1, I would like resell the books, pass them on, and if I really enjoyed the books, the second 2, then I would probably buy book 2. So that was what I did. Both of these actually deserve to be talked about later in the video. I would describe both of these as at least good, maybe very good. So Volume 3 does make it clear that you've missed something if you have not read Volume 2, because an adventure they obviously had in that book is referenced quite a bit, but not so much that it ruined this book. I thought the plot was a lot stronger. This ties in a lot more with Sherlock Holmes, and it takes place after the Reichenbach falls. If you've read Sherlock Holmes, you will know what I'm talking about. And so the 4 find themselves helping out Sherlock Holmes in a time where not a lot of people are aware of where he is. It also ties in quite nicely with the sort of supervillains who are involved or were involved with Moriarty. It involves sort of tracking them down, and I thought that this was a really strong graphic novel. I like this one a lot more than Volume 1. I still think the characters are really interesting. I particularly like Charlie and the cat Watson. Following that, I did also read Volume 4, and Volume 4 actually collected together quite a strong comic strip, and then what turned out to be, must have been a book called The World of the Baker Street Four. These were originally in French, Le Monde des Quatre de Baker Street, and The World of Baker Street is actually much more text heavy. It's got like full page stories, and it was quite interesting because it had backstories for each of the 3 main characters. I would have liked to hear the origin story of the cat as well, but that wasn't there. But it was also predominantly non-fiction about Victorian London, and a bit of sort of non-fiction on fiction, like profiles on Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. So I did like that. I thought it was very interesting, but I probably would have preferred more comic strip, just as a personal preference. And I definitely will be looking out for a copy of Volume 2, because again, there were references to it. It's obviously quite an interesting plot from what I've heard from the later 2, so I will go back to that series when I get that book. The next 3 books are books I read for the Women's Prize, so I won't say too much about them, but let's start with The Dog of the North. The Dog of the North by Elizabeth McKenzie. I haven't actually spoken about this one in full because I hadn't finished it when I filmed my Women's Prize video. This is a random book. I did find it very pacey and it kept me wanting to read it, but it's just chaos. It's about like a really chaotic woman called Penny, whose life is, to be honest, a massive mess. And she gets herself involved with various other messy characters, the best of which is a small dog called Queecoats. And I really enjoyed the backstory of Queecoats. That made me laugh. However, the rest of the book didn't really make me laugh. This isn't really my type of book. It's absolutely crazy. I felt like I had no idea what was going on or what was going to happen in this one. And for some reason that was actually okay with me. It's a very unusual book. To be honest, it's already massively fading from my mind, but let's just say the ending is just as bonkers as the rest of the book. Next up, another book that didn't go through to the shortlist was Children of Paradise by Camilla Gradova. I have talked about this extensively in another video, but this is basically a book about a cinema, and quite a weird cinema. Lots and lots of mention of bodily fluids is the negative side of this book. The positive side of the book was I found it quite readable and I really wanted to keep going to find out what was going on, although I didn't find the ending that satisfying. I would pick up this author again though. Next up, Cursed Bread by Sophie McIntosh. Again, this was a perfectly fine book, pretty good. I did actually enjoy this when I was reading it. I really enjoyed the style of writing. I think this is being sold as it's a book about a mass poisoning in a village in France. And actually it's a book about a woman becoming obsessed with 2 new residents of the village. Yes, there is a mass poisoning, but that's happening very much in the background. I thought it was a cleverly done book. I did enjoy it. This also didn't make it to the shortlist. Right, next up, I picked this one up randomly at the library because I'd seen it a couple of times and wanted to see what it was like. It was The Sad Ghost Club by Liz Middings. And this was fine. I think that this would be a really good book for angsty teenagers, or just teenagers who maybe are struggling to feel that they fit in or feel like they might be alone in their feelings of loneliness. I am not any of those groups of people, but I did appreciate that that was the message of this book, and I don't think that that was a bad thing. It just didn't particularly do all that much for me. It's an interesting art style, very quick to read. I read this when I was feeling really rubbish and it was fine. It was fine. I probably won't carry on with this series, but only because I don't think it's aimed at me at all. And although I found things to enjoy about it and think it's a really good book, it prompted no emotional response from me, and I could just tell that it's not written with me in mind, which is fine. So next up, and the last one in my good category, be The Canterville Ghost by Oscar Wilde. It wasn't this whole book, it was a very short story. The Canterville Ghost a high-low idealistic romance. Now, I read this with Berna from Berna's Bookish Adventures. We always have fun on our buddy reads, and this was no different. I felt like this was a short story of two halves. So the first half was very much absolutely hilarious and predominantly about a ghost. The second half went a bit weird and was much more serious. I enjoyed this. I thought it was interesting what it was saying about society, different groups of people and nationalities, and like life and death basically. But personally for me, the ending was a letdown after the beginning. So not my favourite of Oscar Wilde's works that I've read so far, but it's still a very enjoyable story. I felt like the ending was a bit ambiguous and I would have liked less ambiguity. Next we're going into the very good books, and again I have two to begin with that were from the Women's Prize. I haven't talked about one of these yet, and that's Wandering Souls by Cecile Pan, and I have mixed feelings about Wandering Souls. I feel like I might be the only person who didn't absolutely love this, but I'm sure that's not true. But I did feel really, really guilty about not loving it. But when I say I don't love it, I still rated this 4 stars. I still would put it into my very good category of books. It was a good listen. I would definitely read whatever this debut author comes out with next, because I thought her ideas were really, really interesting. So this book is basically the story of 3 Vietnamese orphans, refugees from Vietnam, in the course of them attempting to emigrate to America. The 3 of them go on a separate boat to their mum, dad and younger siblings, and their mum, dad and siblings tragically don't make it. This really follows mainly Anne, who is the oldest sibling, and how she and her 2 brothers cope with what follows. What I really enjoyed about this book was it also pieced in factual stories from the time. It also had another perspective, which was a first-person perspective, which appeared to be from the point of view of a writer or a researcher. And it is revealed towards the end of the book who that voice is, I believe. I thought this was well done, and I really liked this idea, and I personally enjoyed that strand of narrative more than the rest of the strands. My main problem with this book was that the main narrative about An and Min and Tang was that I didn't feel like there was enough character development. Yes, this is predominantly a book about grief and generational trauma, but I feel like I did get to know Anne's grief, but I didn't get to know her as a person. And I don't feel that these characters are particularly drawn in detail. I would have really liked to get to know them, and if that had have made it a longer book, I think that would have been fine. I would have actually liked this book to be longer, and I very much don't often say that. I do understand why this might have been done, to sort of keep you at a distance from the characters, because the second generation had that distance from their parents. Their parents didn't talk about this. I get why that might have been there, why the author made that choice, but it was the thing that got in the way of this book being really, really emotionally impactful for me. I would have really liked to know those characters better. So a really, really interesting book, but not one that I enjoyed as much as I was hoping to. And in the same vein, we also have Stoneblind by Natalie Haynes, another one I listened to on audio. This one I thought was really, really successful as an audiobook. Natalie Haynes reading it definitely brought another dimension to Stoneblind that I don't think I would have got from the page. I talked about this one elsewhere, so do go and find that in the links down below if you would like to. I thought Medusa's story was the strongest aspect of this. I thought other aspects of it were maybe not as interesting for me, but still a very good book. Next up, a book that I listened to for Trans Girl April, which was a readathon hosted by the lovely Kevi over at Say Kevi and Willow over at Books and Bow, was None of the Above by Travis Alabanza. Again, this was another book that I would really, really recommend listening to as an audiobook, because the author Travis also reads their own book. The subtitle of this book is Reflections on Life Beyond the Binary. And this is very much a book about Travis Alabanza sharing their experiences about being gender non-conforming and being non-binary. And this is a topic that I have really read extremely little about, so I did feel like I learned a lot. I feel that again the author brought something extra to their own work in this audiobook. I think the concept of this book is so strong. There's 7 chapters, and each of the 7 chapters begins with and has repeated throughout a phrase that has been said to Travis at some point in their life. Some of them negative, some of them more positive, and through these statements they explore what it has meant to them to be who they are. And I found this so interesting. I feel like I learnt a lot about gender identity, and particularly about the experiences of one particular non-binary person. I thought Travis was a hugely interesting person who had obviously thought a lot and put a lot into their book. Next up, The Tea Dragon Society by Kay O'Neill. This was the book that I read as an ebook, and this was just a really beautiful graphic novel, very cosy, lovely vibes. It was about some tea dragons, which are tiny dragons, and the people who take care of them, and it took place over the seasons of the year. I really enjoyed this. I sat and read this in one sitting, and it's just a delightful book, and I would definitely pick up the other books in this series. I believe there are 2 more. Another graphic novel, another lovely experience. So next up, a book from my actual own TBR, and that was Bulldog Drummond by Sapper. I was really excited to finish this in the month of April because I actually finished it very close to my BookTube anniversary. I've been on BookTube 2 years as of the 29th of April, and in that very first video, which was a TBR for the 1900 to 1950 readathon, I mentioned Bulldog Drummond, and this was the only book of the books that I had collected from my bookshelf for the 1900 to 1950 readathon in May 2021. Yeah, this was the only book on that first TBR that I didn't read that month, and I had this on one of my lists of books that I wanted to get to in 2023, and the lovely Janelle from Too Fond of Books agreed to buddy read this with me, and we had a great time with this. I think Bulldog Drummond is a really fun character from the sort of post First World War period, and this definitely had vibes of Agatha Christie's early thrillers for me, and a nice link in with Tommy and Tuppence, their first adventure, The Secret Adversary. Pretty much has the same sort of plot device impetus of them placing an advert because they are bored after coming back from war. Bulldog Drummond does the same, and he's drawn into a lot more than he bargained for. Some really Bond villainish people are sort of aiming for world domination, I think. But yeah, you could definitely see from this book that Ian Fleming was extremely influenced by Bulldog Drummond when he wrote James Bond, and that was really interesting to see because I wasn't expecting that. I did enjoy this. Apparently, I think 10 Bulldog Drummond books were written by Sapper, which was the pen name of Herman Cyril McNeill. I believe that actually some other authors continued writing Bulldog Drummond's adventures after his death, which is also interesting. So yeah, this was like pretty much a sort of almost like a spy thriller romp, although there's not spies in it, but similar. So I did really enjoy this. Fun to read. Another interesting sort of classic crime from the 1920s. I'm really glad I got to this. Next up, we have the final book that I managed to get to for Trans Girl April, and that was Welcome to St. Hell, My Trans Teen Misadventure by Lewis Hancox. And again, I found this incredibly informative, and I sometimes think that graphic memoirs can really get across so much more information in such an easily digestible way for me, and this was the case with this one. I thought this was emotional and just really well done. In Welcome to St. Hell, the concept is that Lewis Hancox is writing this talking to his teen self, Lois. And Lewis draws and writes about his teen experiences while sort of talking to the characters in his book, including his mum and his dad, and them saying how their perspectives have changed over time and how they might wish their reaction would change if they had another chance at it. It's really well discussed, and it also takes in what sort of hoops have to be jumped through medically in the UK in order to transition. And I love the way Lewis Hancock's had written this with so much sort of positivity, but also reflection on his life. I just thought, again, this was a book that was so interesting. As well as being interesting, this was also a really enjoyable read, a really well put together graphic memoir. And yeah, I really liked Lewis's style. I've heard he has a YouTube channel as well with comedy that I would definitely take a look at. And yeah, I thought this was absolutely great. I would definitely read more graphic memoirs or graphic novels from Lewis Hancock's. A brilliant, brilliant book, and very, very close to being like a 5-star read for me. I do actually think that the next 2 books, although I read them more recently, probably did enjoy them slightly less than Welcome to St. Hell, but all of those 3 I really enjoyed all of them. So the next one is The Bandit Queens by Perini Schroff. I've already talked about this in my Women's Prize video. I mean, I thought that this was a really good combination of humour, but also like really, really dark stuff. I felt like I was learning about the caste system and being a wife in India, and yet it was also kind of murdery vibes, and a really, really interesting debut novel. I would definitely get to whatever Perini Schroff writes next. However, this wasn't a 5-star book for me. It was really, really enjoyable, but it took me a little while to get into. Right, finally, in my very good category, we have The Favour by Nicci French. I was sent this copy as an AdPR copy by Tandem Collective, who I will link in the description down below. It's by one of my absolute favourite authors. In fact, author team, because it's a husband and wife writing team. And I thought The Favour was really, really good. A strong Nicci French standalone book. But for me, it wasn't probably my favourite Nicci French. I thought it was really, really good. It had a lot of elements that Nicci French often have in their books. And it definitely did what they do really, really well, which is that blend of normal life versus something happening to derail that normal life. I did think that this one, and I won't say too much about it because it is a thriller and spoilers, but this is a book about Jude, who, when she was a teenager, had a relationship with a guy called Liam. They were in a car accident, which effectively ended their relationship. Basically, this is set 11 years later when Liam suddenly reappears in Jude's life and asks for a favour. So if that sounds good to you, definitely pick this book up. I did think that this one required a little bit of suspension of disbelief, especially around Jude's decision making. But I do think that that is a common theme in Nicci French. They quite often have very intelligent characters who have clearly got like high-powered jobs. For example, Jude in this is a doctor, and yet they still make these really silly decisions. I guess that's what thrillers are all about. And yeah, despite this requiring a little bit of suspension of disbelief, I did really enjoy it. It's very, very fast-paced. I read it probably in a day, maybe tipped over into a second day, but yeah, really, really good fun, as always with Nicci French. If you've read Nicci French before, you'll know what sort of thing to expect, and I don't think you'll be too disappointed as long as you can suspend your disbelief. Really, really loved this. So we have 3 books left to talk about in my favourites of the month category, and I was a little bit undecided whether to put this 3rd book into this category because it's the only one in the category that I didn't give 5 stars to. I've put it here. but it wasn't quite 5 stars for me, but so close, was Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is just such a different book. I thought it was completely different to anything that I have read. This is about a couple, Leah and Miri, and Leah has returned from a mission under the sea on a submarine that went very wrong. And this follows her in the past on that mission, while also showing us their present day life through the eyes of Miri, her wife. Miri is struggling with the fact that Leah has come back from under the sea different. And it also deals with Miri telling us about what life has been like without Leah there, how she's had to come to believe that she may well not be coming back, and then she has come back and everything's different. And it's certainly a book with a lot of grief, a grieving process of like grieving for somebody who is actually still alive. I really enjoyed the sort of past timeline and the tension of Leah's story, but also like the tension in this story in general is like really, really well done. I thought it was an excellent book that kind of defies genres. Like I wouldn't be able to say what genre I think this is, but yeah, whatever it was, I was captivated. I thought it was a really excellent book. The writing was so interesting. I'm not sure that I found the ending completely satisfying, but it did fit really well. So finally, we have 2 5-star reads. One of them is a reread, so I'm going to talk about that first, but I'm not going to talk about it in too much depth because this is also the FOMO Book Club pick, which we are going to be talking about over on Jack's channel on Saturday afternoon. My reread 5-star book was Goodnight Mr. Tom by Michelle Magorian. And oh my goodness, this book and my heart is just so devastating, so wonderfully written. I read this as a child. I can't believe this didn't completely break me as a child. I have also seen the adaptation and it was still as good on, like, I suppose the 3rd time I've come to this particular story. So this is the story of Willie Beach, an evacuee from London who comes to live with Mr. Tom, who's a man who has lived alone for many years in the village, kept himself to himself. This is all about what happens when he takes Will into his life, and just there are so many devastating things in this book. The backdrop of the Second World War, of course, which does intrude into the storyline. The friendships in this book are wonderful. The characters in this book are so well drawn, and there are some really, really terrible events in this. But even with all that, this is a book that I find warm and so wonderful. This is an absolute favourite, I would say, a book that I feel like I will come back to again and again, and I will probably watch the adaptation again. Don't know if I'm going to do that before our discussion. If this video comes out after Sunday, you can find it over on Jack's channel and watch it on the replay, and we will be talking all things Goodnight Mr. Tom. And finally, my 5-star read that was brand new to me book, that has just blown me away with its brilliance, is The Secrets of Hartwood Hall by Katie Lumsden. And yes, I did go to Katie's launch party and that was amazing in itself, and I did think to myself that it might be difficult to separate the enjoyment of that event and how lovely Katie is from the writing, but I found myself completely able to do that, and I was so impressed by this. Katie is such an accomplished writer, and this is just such a good story. I was absolutely gripped from beginning to end of The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, and I think that this is a historical fiction that anyone can enjoy. Although I really like Victorian fiction, I'm not traditionally a lover of like historical fiction set in the Victorian times, and I would actually say I've read either very little or none of it, but this was just so impressive, especially as a debut novel. This is about Margaret Lennox, who is recently widowed, and she takes a post as a governess at the eponymous Hartwood Hall, and this follows her to Hartwood Hall, meeting her new young charge, Louis, and it's just such a good story. So this is a novel that is in conversation with the Brontes, really. I have watched Katie's video where she talks about the influences on this book and of Victorian literature in particular, and for me, I could see really cleverly woven into this book that conversation with the Brontes. And although Katie has openly said that this is a book in conversation with Jane Eyre, and there are elements of Jane Eyre in here, it also, for me, and I know that this also was on purpose, for me, much more what jumped out about the influences of this book was The Tenant of Wildfell Hall. And The Tenant of Wildfell Hall was one of my absolute favourite books the year I read it. I was so astonished by it, so taken aback, because I just think it is the best Bronte book. So surprising, so unexpectedly like ahead of its time and feminist, and just such a good read. And Katie's book is reminiscent of The Tenant of Hartwood Hall. There are certainly elements from her love of that book and from her loves of Victorian literature in general woven into this. Comparing this to the Brontes doesn't really do it justice, because I felt like I was reading a Victorian book, but at the same time it felt so much more accessible than reading a Victorian classic. I just thought Katie's writing was absolutely incredible. So I didn't know what to expect from this book, but absolutely loved it. Thought it was a fantastic novel. And for me, I could see a lot of Daphne du Maurier in this as well. I just think that Katie Lumsden has written an amazing book here, and absolutely one of my favourite reads this year so far. Had a lovely time with this, and you can of course find out lots more about this book, all of the publication journey, all of the influences. I will link those videos down below because they are all on Katie's wonderful booktube channel, Books and Things. If you haven't checked out that channel and you haven't checked out this book, definitely do it. You won't be disappointed. Those were all of the books I read in the month of April. The TBR has been taking a beating in recent months. So let's look at the numbers. At the end of March, the giant TBR was standing at 172 books. I received my crime subscription book again this month, so that took us to 173. I also showed in a video with that as a mini haul video 3 other books that I'm going to put onto my giant TBR, which brings us to 176 books. My mum bought me a present from a charity shop, which I haven't shown in a video yet. She gave it to me quite recently, and that's The Girl of Ink and Stars by Kieran Millward Hargrave. Yeah, I can't wait to read this. Beautiful cover, and I really enjoyed Julia and the Shark, so really happy to have a copy of this one. So that brought me up to 177 books. I read 7 books from the giant TBR. They were Our Wives Under the Sea, The Baker Street 4, Volume 1, The Secrets of Hartwood Hall, Bulldog Drummond, The Favour, The Baker Street 4 Volume 3, and The Baker Street 4 Volume 4. So that brings us down to 170 books. Yay! I'm very glad the giant TBR has gone down this month. A bit disappointed it hasn't gone down more, but I did haul books, and I did need to haul those books because I wanted to read some of them in May. No regrets. I have remembered that I did say in my book haul from Bath that I was going to try to balance the TBR more by reading 3 books for every 1 book that I haul. I didn't do that in April. Everything went out of the window in April because I wasn't very well, so that's my excuse and I'm sticking to it. I am going to try and begin that in May, so if I do haul a book, I do need to read 3 books from my giant TBR to balance that out, and I'll let you know at the end of May whether that works out at all. Do let me know, what were your favourite books in the month of April? Have you read any of these books, and what did you think of them? I'd love to hear from you in the comments, and if you have enjoyed this video today, please do give it a like. Please do consider subscribing if you haven't already, and I will hope very much to see you all again soon for another video all about books here on Alice and the Giant Bookshelf. Bye for now.